Good morning from Washington, D.C. Good evening to Taipei, and welcome to everyone tuning in from elsewhere around the world. My name is Marcus Garlauskas, and I'm the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Thank you for joining us for this Cross-Strait and Beyond seminar on today's topic of bolstering Taiwan's resilience in the face of threats from the People's Republic of China. For those of you who are not familiar, the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative is one of the 4 programs of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Through written products, multimedia content, public and private events, including tabletop exercises, we inform and shape the strategies, plans, and policies of the United States and its allies and partners to address key rising challenges in the Indo-Pacific. Convenings like this one are integral to the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. Today, we'll be discussing Taiwan's resilience in the context of the Atlantic Council's recent report Toward Resilience, an Action Plan for Taiwan in the Face of PRC Aggression by Franklin Kramer, Elizabeth Seisland, Philip Yu, and Joseph Webster. The report highlights the centrality of enhanced resilience for deterring and defeating PRC aggression against Taiwan and identifies pathways to boost resilience through several key sectors. Today's session is supported by the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, TECRO, in the United States. And I'd also like to give special thanks to Atlantic Council Executive Vice Chair Adrienne Arsht for her support for the Scowcroft Center's Resilience Initiative that helped enable the publication and dissemination of this important report. That said, the Atlantic Council's strict intellectual independence policy applies to this session and to the report, and so the views expressed in this event reflect those of the individual participants and not those of the Atlantic Council, any of its leaders, any government organization, or any of its other sponsors. Now, I returned from Taiwan myself just a few weeks ago, visiting as part of an Atlantic Council delegation, during which we met with newly inaugurated President Lai and many other officials. I came away impressed by the progress of Taiwan's defenses since our last visit. I also saw momentum toward fully implementing the all-out national defense concept, which had been emphasized under President Tsai, including we saw the follow-through with the execution of plans to extend the length of conscription. And now this year, the word resilience was also very much at the forefront of our conversations. And now the exact meaning of resilience as it's applied in Taiwan can be difficult to nail down. But in our discussions, I considered it to mean Taiwan's will and ability to withstand shocks, particularly Chinese coercion, as well as to adapt and sustain its defenses while under attack. And this is similar to the focus of this report. So this resilience of Taiwan, improving the resilience, could really be critical, not only to being able to withstand a Chinese attack, but also to deter Chinese aggression and to by working to convince Beijing that China will be unable to push Taiwan to the point of concession or be able to emerge victorious in the event of attacks. So now shifting focus to the report, we're pleased to have here with us the 4 authors of the report and also a resilience expert from Taiwan National University to discuss this important and timely topic. So to begin the discussion, I'd like to welcome our 3 opening speakers, Mr. Franklin Kramer, Board Director and Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Ms. Elizabeth Beth Seisland, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Strategy Initiative, and Dr. Hengda Su, Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Director of the Taiwan Social Resilience Center at Taiwan National University. Now, after our distinguished speakers provide their opening remarks, we'll move to a moderated discussion and audience Q&A. So please don't forget to submit your questions by typing askac.org into your web browser. Now, our first speaker, Frank Kramer, who led this report, is the board director of the Atlantic Council, who exercises a senior leadership role, as well as a distinguished fellow who's a thought leader and author with a track record of groundbreaking research published by the council. He served as a senior U.S. government political appointee in 2 administrations, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He's also been a distinguished research fellow at the Center for Technology and National Security Policy at the National Defense University and an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Frank's an expert across a wide range of issues in national security and foreign policy, and several of his focus areas include conventional and hybrid defense, China-Taiwan-U.S. relations, and innovation in national security. So, Frank, thank you so much for being here and for leading this very important report. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Marcus, and thanks to all of my co-authors. And I appreciate the opportunity, and good morning to the audience. I think a good way to start, perhaps, is with what might be maybe it's an elephant in the room, which is to say, former President Trump's recent statement in a recent interview to the effect that Taiwan should actually pay the United States for providing defense. Now, the tenor of that remark, I think, is obviously in contrast to what's long been the United States policy under the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed in 1979. And that act, which is the law of the land, basically has three elements. And the first element is that it's the obligation of the United States to provide and help Taiwan have a so-called sufficient self-defense capability. The second aspect of the Taiwan Relations Act is that the United States itself should have a capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion, for example, blockade, that would affect the security of Taiwan. And then the third element of the act is that if there is any effort to cause Taiwan to change its circumstances by other than peaceful means, so for example, by boycotts or embargoes, then that would be of grave concern to the United States. So, by way of contrast to what former President Trump has said, President Biden on several occasions has actually said that the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan. That's a little bit further out than the actual words of the TRA, but it gives a sense of the differentiation of approaches. But President Trump is correct on another aspect that he said, that the defense of Taiwan itself in a military conflict would be difficult. And one key area is the tyranny of distance, how far away Taiwan is from the United States. So Taiwan's resilience in the context of a military conflict or potential military conflict would be quite important, so it could maintain its defense until the United States could be available in full force. In addition, resilience comes up in a number of different ways, and especially because we've seen China undertake a series of non-kinetic attacks against Taiwan. So there have been continuous cyber attacks. There have been many disinformation campaigns. There have been intrusive military maneuvers, such as airplanes coming across the immediate line. And all that has led to significant concern, I would say, that it's possible that the PRC would undertake a blockade or some similar type of activity to cause Taiwan to give up on the way it maintains its current system. Our focus in the report, therefore, has been on both what the United States ought to do, what Taiwan ought to do with respect to dealing with a military conflict, and what Taiwan and the United States ought to do with respect to dealing with a less than all-out kinetic conflict. One of the key areas is to have an overall approach for Taiwan, and in that regard, Beth Seislin has spent a lot of time working on that and is principal author of that aspect of the report. So let me introduce Beth. She's a non-resident fellow, as Marcus already said, at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center. She has over 20 years of national security experience in the United Kingdom government, prior to working as the UK's Joint Intelligence Organization attaché in Washington. She was a Deputy National Security Advisor in the UK, advisor to the Prime Minister on intelligence, on security, on resilience issues. She has expertise in a wide variety of security domains, including national resilience, countering state threats, and cybersecurity. So with that, Beth, let me turn it over to you for a look at the issues involving comprehensive defense and resilience. Thanks.
Right, thank you so much, Frank. And I'll just say hello to everyone out there. And it's really great to be part of the conversation this morning. I thought I would just spend a couple of minutes. Marcus has already touched on this. Resilience is quite a sort of amorphous concept, and I just wanted to spend a little bit of time just explaining what we meant by resilience when we were writing this report. And then I'll just touch on the areas of focus for central government when trying to organise for success that we've included in the report. So firstly, I think when people think about national resilience, they tend to think about more defence orientated activities or preparedness. And certainly resilience does encompass that. But to my mind, it's a much broader concept. And that's why it's such a powerful concept to try and pursue at a national level. So when I talk about resilience, I'm talking about a country's ability to manage the full cycle of risk. So, and we touch on this in the report. So you have to be able to, in the first place, identify risk and to be able to assess it and understand it in a sophisticated way to be able to make informed decisions about what your priorities are as a country in terms of reducing risk. So it's identification, it's understanding, and then it's using that knowledge to try and reduce your strategic vulnerabilities or to impact on threat vectors. So either the intent or the capability of your adversaries. But as we know, crises are not always avoidable. So the ability to be able to respond well is also a huge part of being a resilient nation. And then finally, the ability to learn lessons and to embed those back into your system. So when we talk about resilience, it's that management of the full cycle of risk. And we talk in the report about resilience being a team game. And I think that's really crucial to this concept of comprehensive security that we describe. And really important to flag that when we're talking about comprehensive security, we are talking about engaging the whole nation. But only central government, only at a national level, at the heart of government, can the direction be driven. So it's really important to have a team captain, and for that team captain to make a very deliberate approach to developing resilience and to pursuing it consistently and deliberately over time. So I'll just touch on what we've covered on the report specifically. A comprehensive approach. So there are some great examples of this in Sweden and Finland that we've touched on here. And I think why they are such important examples is that they recognise that national security is no longer just the preserve of the defence community, the intelligence community, and the foreign policy community. What we're talking about here is taking national security and including the whole of society. So where we are facing these all of society threats, and Frank has touched on that. So whether that is cyber incursions, whether that is misinformation, disinformation, whether that is the targeting of critical national infrastructure, that demands a more inclusive partnership approach across government, out into communities, and crucially with the private sector. So we specifically talk about activating the whole nation. And again, this is the preserve of central government. So how you do this is different in every country and will depend on culture and will depend on the types of activities that will trigger a nation into action. But essentially, we are talking about inspiring, we're talking about engaging, we're talking about articulating risk. And I think thinking about Taiwan, thinking about all of those things and how they will set up a program of engagement, I think will be really important to set the scene. It's the kind of fundamentals of resilience. Understanding risk. So this is really kind of programmatic analytical work. So you're developing a set of scenarios here, thinking about what are the risks that might be faced and then prioritizing them, because Taiwan, like every other country, is facing resource constraints. So it's really important to be able to understand where in that kind of spectrum of risk you're going to focus your efforts. And of course, Frank will come on to some of the suggestions in that space shortly. We also talk about building data capability. And this is a vast space, but it can be broken down into more digestible chunks. So if you have this set of scenarios, and a prioritized set of scenarios, you can then use those to identify what information, what data you might need in any given scenario. And it's really important to get ahead of that before a crisis, because data sharing, as we all know, is extremely complex. It's not just about government data, it's about partnership more broadly. So actually trying to gather that ahead of time and to create those connections and to be able to draw that in is really important, as is having the capabilities and the professional skills in government to be able to understand and exploit all of that data. And that leads sort of nicely onto that topic of professional skills, because when you're in a crisis moment, it's incredibly difficult to get the right skill sets in to do the jobs that you need in that moment. So thinking ahead of time and auditing, what will be required in terms of policy skills, data skills, crisis management, and really trying to shape and promote that now, I think, is a really key element of resilience. And then finally, preparedness and planning. So really, really important. And we all know that crises never they never come in exactly the form that you expect, and they never conform to the plan that you've made. But planning is so important because it's a pivot point for your activities. It builds connections across government. It develops those partnerships as you plan together and exercise together, and it gives you a point from which to adapt. And that essentially gives you a head start in any crisis scenario. So they were the specific kind of organisational elements that we touched on in the report. But I'm going to hand back to Frank now, because we have some much more sector-specific thoughts that he will now share with you.
Thanks very much, Beth. So as Beth said, we took a hard look at what the risks are that Taiwan is facing. And since we couldn't write about everything, we selected out three. And the areas that we selected were cybersecurity, energy, and then defense, military defense. And let me just turn to what you might call the wave tops of what we said in the report. The reason for selecting cybersecurity really is because the number of attacks against Taiwan is remarkably notable. The estimates vary. Some talk about 5 million cyber attacks per day. Some talk about 15,000 cyber attacks per second. Some talk about 100 hacking groups in China undertaking attacks against Taiwan. However you decide on the numbers, they're very, very large. And so we thought that there were several key elements that Taiwan needed to focus on. The first is to be more resilient by creating cloud-based capabilities that would duplicate government functions and that could be put off the island, so to speak, in a safer place to enhance resilience. Now, this has been done by Ukraine in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, and it's generated a much safer, a much more effective governmental functioning. The second area, which we think is quite important, is for the government of Taiwan to work with high-end private sector cybersecurity expert firms to enhance resilience, both for governmental functions, but also importantly for critical infrastructures. So that would involve for things like the energy grid, it would involve ports, it would involve water and the like, all key critical infrastructures. That could be complemented by the U.S. Cyber Command, which has a so-called Hunt Forward program, working with allies and partners to help eliminate malware on networks. So a combination of high-end private security providers, plus perhaps the United States government. And we have statements by Ann Neuberger, who was or is, I should say, the Deputy National Security Advisor, to the effect that the United States would support Taiwan in such a contingency. We also think it's terribly important, as Beth already talked about, individuals are key. There are never enough cybersecurity experts, but we think it'd be very valuable for Taiwan to generate what I would call a civilian cyber reserve. Several countries have done this. United Kingdom is one, Estonia is another, making sure as much as is possible that we have enough people to deal with the cyber attack. So a civilian cyber reserve. And then lastly, it will be important for Taiwan to be able to have continued communications with the outside world, particularly with the United States. That is largely done these days by undersea cables. Cables have been cut. Taiwan's undersea cables have been cut, not all of them. But in a wartime scenario, one could worry about that. And the alternative way to have communications is what are called low Earth orbit satellites. There are a great many of those being put in place now, both civilian and military. And so it'll be important for Taiwan, which is generating its own small low Earth orbit communications capabilities, several satellites, to not only do that, but also to link into United States capabilities, both on the civilian side and on the military side. On the energy arena, the basic problem for Taiwan is that it gets approximately 97% of its energy through maritime imports. And those obviously are subject to disruption in the context of a blockade or in the context of wartime. So to deal with that, what the report talks about are three things. One is rationing. One is focusing on demand and reducing demand as appropriate, and one is increasing supply. With respect to rationing, basically what our suggestion is to prepare a variety of rationing plans for different contingencies. As Beth said, it's hard to figure out exactly what would happen, but one can plan for several. And sort out who would get more, who would get less in the context of a actual incursion, kinetic incursion, or a context of a blockade. It's important, and Joe Webster wrote about this, he's the key author of the energy section, to reduce Taiwan's overall demand, and in particular, has very, very inexpensive electricity, even less expensive than in the United States. So working on its overall demand by gradually raising electric prices will be important, which would allow it to function in the event of a contingency somewhat more easily. On the supply side, there are several areas that could be enhanced, and basically they involve utilizing the four areas that Taiwan has, which would be for indigenous production, nuclear energy, onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar. Each of those could be built up, and just by way of example, one could extend the life of Taiwan's nuclear energy power plants and expand their capacity in the nuclear area. The last area we talked about, of course, is defense. Phil Yu was the leader on this. And we had 5 recommendations in that regard. The first, which relates somewhat, not the same, but somewhat to what former President Trump talked about, is the importance of resources. And we basically think that Taiwan needs to spend more on defense than it has been doing so far. It has increased its budget recently in several years, but we think it needs to spend at least 3% of GDP on defense in order to have an adequate defense capability and a more resilient capability. We think Taiwan can do a lot, secondly, by building on its very substantial technical capabilities. We've seen in Ukraine development of what some people have called a public-private capability accelerator. We think Taiwan should think about that, working on this, trying to generate new capabilities. And that brings us to the third area, which are the possibility for low cost and high effectiveness capabilities with things like unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and the like. And we've seen those be very effective in the Ukraine context. And then we think they could be equally important here. If you're going to work with emerging technologies, you have to have trained and capable people, and militaries themselves need trained, capable, and ready people. Taiwan has recently extended its conscription to 12 months. We think in that conscription, for those conscripts, they ought to be trained not only in classic military skills, use of rifles and the like, but also with respect to emerging technologies. And Phil's underscored this point. So changing the training curriculum for the new enlistees to allow them to be better able to deal with emerging technologies will be very important. I've talked about blockade as a possibility. One has to plan, therefore, for the possibilities of breaking a blockade. And one approach to do that would be working on Taiwan's East Coast ports as a place where blockade, they're obviously the farthest from mainland China. And that's a place where we could potentially have a basis for a blockade being broken. And working on the infrastructures of those ports would be very valuable. And then the last thing, it's already been mentioned, but the all-out defense mobilization, which does exist inside the Ministry of Defense, is designed to bring together all capabilities in the context of a mobilization, in the context of a conflict. But it's working for the Ministry of Defense. That agency needs to be brought up to a national level to do what Beth talked about, which is to say, be able to integrate all the capabilities of the nation, governmental for sure, but also businesses and also people. So with that, let me stop, and Marcus, let me turn it back to you.
Hey, Frank, Beth, thanks so much for that great explanation of some of the key elements of the report. So now, as our respondent for the discussion, we're pleased to have Dr. Hung-Da Su joining us today from Taiwan. Dr. Su is the Dean of the College of Social Sciences at Taiwan National University, where he also serves as professor and the Jean Monnet Chair of the Department of Political Science, and it was relevant to this discussion as the director of the Taiwan Social Resilience Center. In addition to resilience, he specializes in European studies, transnational integration, movement and theory, and Asian regionalism. So welcome, Dr. Su. And given your background, your focus as director of the Social Resilience Center, we're very interested in your thoughts on the report and this subject in general. So Dr. Su, again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you very much for this invitation. And this is a comprehensive report on key issues concerning Taiwan resilience and in an increasingly uncertain and disturbing geopolitical context, even short of war. And I have read this report, and here are my responses or comments as for. First, I suppose the whole report was drafted with the imagine a scenario that Taiwan Island will be under some coercion or even the quarantine or blockade, etc. But I suppose that when we look at Taiwan's security or defense, quite often people just narrow down Taiwan to the Taiwan Island, neglecting those isolates in the neighboring water. That is, for example, the Penghu or Matsu or Kinmen. And so one scenario is if the communication connection between Taiwan Island and this isolates are disturbed or some tensions just rise between the two, which made the connection between the Taiwan Island and this isolate difficult. And that would be also a gray zone possibility. But quite often this part wasn't neglected quite often in any study of the resilience or defense of Taiwan. Though these isolates are small with a few population, but strategically and politically speaking, they are very important. Just imagine if these isolates are isolated from Taiwan Island for 1 month. So what shall we do? So that is a scenario that I just want to add for any study of the resilience of Taiwan in the uncertain geopolitical situation. That is the first point. And second, you selected the 3 key sectors: energy, cybersecurity, and defense, and you really highlighted some very key issues and even weak points of Taiwan. And you also suggested some policies to the government or Taiwanese people, including, for example, the increasing of the defense budget to 3% of GDP, to have the low Earth orbit system, in case of the problems of the connection of the cables between Taiwan and overseas, particularly United States and Central. And but a big question is all this indicates the increase of the budget in Taiwan, and even increase of the debt ratio in Taiwan. And that is a big debate. I prepared the slide, but I'm sorry to fail to show it. But if we look at the Taiwanese budget, totally the biggest three parts are defense, economic, and the social welfare. These are three biggest parts of the budget in Taiwan. And when we have already been in a debate over the increasing of the defense budget or any defense-related industry or preparation, but the problem is which part of the budget will be cut. And quite often, as a professor at the university, we are worried that universities or education could be the first victim of this debate, because no governments in Taiwan dare to cut off any social welfare. And for economic development, that infrastructures are always there to boom the economy and for the election. But it seems that the only less harmful budgetary cut would be the university budget or the educational part. So quite often, as the professors or educational people, we're in dilemma. We support strong defense, but where comes the money? So that is really a dilemma. So for me, the second one, for example, to increase the electricity price and to increase the water price and to make the energy price reasonable, I fully agree with that. But no governments dare to do it, because over the past decades, all the governments, for example, Mind Joe, he just increased the budget, increased the prices, and his party failed in the election. So that is one. I suppose Tsai Ing-wen did really a favor to the newly inaugurated President Lai, because before the end of her term, she increased the price for electricity, making the successor easier to follow the track. So I suppose the budgetary constraint will be the second, because according to the public debt law in Taiwan, the debt ratio of GDP, the ceiling is 50%, and now we are nearly 40%. So that means the increasing debt room is we still have 10%. Surely, I know compared to other countries in the world, the ratio is still very low. But remember that Taiwan is an isolated member in the world. We cannot get any loans from IMF or from the World Bank, so we have to be self-reliant. So that is the second, the budget. And third one, that is the trust in the leadership and government. In the slide that I prepared for this comment, you can see in the list from the most trusted professionals to the least trusted professional. On the top, the first one is a family member. That means who you trust the most. The firstly follow the family member, followed by medical doctor and professors and policemen. And the central government is the middle. And to be worse, the president is, that means in the middle, most trusted by the people. But the ministers and the government are less trusted on the list. And the legislators are among the three least trusted professionals in Taiwan, and with the journalists at the bottom. So, and the judges just between the journalists and the legislators. So that means in Taiwan, I would say we are a young democracy. So the general trust in the government is not solid enough to encourage any leadership in Taiwan to implement such a gigantic, comprehensive defense project within a short time. So that is, I suppose, the difficulty for any leaders in Taiwan. And last but not least is Taiwan's economic relationship with mainland China. So I just quote a dialogue between me and Mearsheimer just 1 year ago when he came to Taiwan. He just challenged us, why did you, Taiwan, made yourself so dependent on mainland China in terms of market, investment, trade, and you never imagined to regulate your trade investment relationship with mainland China? But my response is, over the past 30 years, and all the Taiwanese governments were trying to regulate this relationship with mainland China, because we all know, no matter who was in power, we knew that we are still in a very difficult and strange relationship, that they are still threatening Taiwan and unify Taiwan if necessary with force. But the problem until just several years ago was that when the Taiwanese government unilaterally intended to regulate this relationship, while the world with the US was open to mainland China, we cannot do it. We could not regulate our investment in and trade with mainland China when the world was open to mainland Chinese market and investment. Imagine that Taiwanese people, business people, investors, they could create a company in the US and then transfer money to the US and then invest in mainland China. So the government continuously failed to regulate this relationship. So now it's changing, but we are not still very clear about the future of American trade investment policy toward mainland China, and that will be very vital for Taiwanese economic strategies in the future. So last but not least, thank you for the invitation. Congratulations for the report. These are my 4 comments to share with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dr. Su, thank you very much. Great comments and very, very clear and well organized. Will give us a lot to think about. So now we'll move to the moderated discussion and the audience Q&A portion of the event, and we'll be drawing audience questions from askac.org. So if you're interested, please do submit your questions for our speakers. We have a number already in train, but I think we have space for some to address some additional questions. And before we begin, as we go into this broader discussion, I'd also like to introduce Rear Admiral Phil Yu and Mr. Joe Webster, co-authors of the report, alongside Frank and Beth, who are both affiliated with IPSI. And Phil Yu is a retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral now working in the private sector. He's a non-resident senior fellow with the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative, as I mentioned. He began his Navy career serving aboard fast attack nuclear submarines and ballistic missile submarines in the U.S. Navy. And as a senior foreign area officer, he was responsible for risk reduction dialogue between the U.S. military and the People's Liberation Army of China. And as the capstone assignment of a distinguished foreign area officer career, he served as the U.S. Defense Attaché to the Russian Federation, advising and reporting on events in Moscow, actually during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, Joe Webster is a non-resident senior fellow at the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative as well, and he's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. He is the editor of the China-Russia Report, an independent nonpartisan newsletter that explores developments in Sino-Russian relations. And Joe actually has the distinction of being one of the first analysts to have publicly explained in detail the tremendous economic support that China's been providing to the Russian war effort against Ukraine, and I was proud to be able to co-author with him a couple of pieces on this subject. Joe also specializes in energy geopolitics, and his analyses on these subjects have been published across leading media platforms, including the Wall Street Journal and Politico. And so to draw Phil and Joe into the conversation, I'd like to start the discussion with a question for each of them. So first, one for Phil. Phil, so we've been seeing all of this military activity from the PRC. They seem to be, as I described in one interview, essentially moving the goalposts around Taiwan, almost literally. And so, what is this new normal cost imposition campaign that China's engaged in? What does it look like? And why is enhancing defense resilience so important for meeting this this new level of Chinese activity? So, Phil, over to you. Looking forward to your thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. And really greatly appreciate being here today. Hello to Dr. Su and the audience in Taiwan. Good evening to you. So as we look at things from a defense perspective, Beijing's rhetoric, actions, recent years is, can be seen as a unilateral rejection of the status quo, which, preserved decades of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. But what it looks like today, and ramped up in recent months, is that from a military perspective, Taiwan's uniformed services, and I say that because it's not just the Navy and the Army, it's also, the Coast Guard pressure. It's a long-term military cost imposition campaign that's really, strategically set and being implemented from Beijing, meant to wear down Taiwan's military hardware. It's meant to exhaust its military personnel, uniformed personnel, and it's meant to interfere with time spent, better spent training for the high-end fight, as a deterrent. And that's why we, in our report, we talk about the importance in that context that resilience is key. Defense resilience is key. Taiwan's uniformed services have a conflicting set of priorities. It's a tough job, and they should be commended for the amount of reforms, as well as innovation and tough decisions, as Dr. Su had brought up, in the midst of all of this. On one hand, they have to reassure the Taiwan public that Taiwan's sovereignty and security are being safeguarded, while avoiding escalation and against an increasingly aggressive and dangerous PLA. And the Atlantic Council has many reports out there about actions by the PLA, whether it's acoustic aggression against Australian ships and Australian sailors. And certainly the audience will be aware of the actions in the South China Sea against our partner, alliance partner, the Philippines. So our report recommends several defense resilience things that can do, but it really comes down to what Beth Seislin, Frank Kramer mentioned at the beginning, is that it needs to be comprehensive, and we need to look at things not just from a military point of view, but how defense resilience can be connected to the greater societal efforts. But in summary, what it looks like today from a military point of view, in a practical manner, at sea, it's ships surrounding the island 360 degrees from the PLA Navy at a very close distance, up to butting up against the 24 nautical mile contiguous zone, with exercise areas, most recently with the punishment exercise areas, so-called punishment exercises following the inauguration, that cross into Taiwan's 24 nautical mile contiguous zone. And the significance of the contiguous zone is the coastal state has certain rights that, some call it lawfare, that clearly Beijing is signaling that, we have the ability to surround you and interfere with those rights of immigration, trade, law enforcement, pollution, that every nation enjoys. It also looks like manned and unmanned aircraft crossing across the tacit median line, which for decades was a symbol of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And it also looks like the disinformation campaigns and the cyber attacks that go on. But it's also a three-dimensional problem in the physical space. It's dozens and dozens of high-altitude surveillance balloons crossing over the island of Taiwan. We in the United States have dealt with this in terms of violation of sovereign airspace. And so as you put that all together, it is a situation in which the status quo is clearly being unilaterally changed. Thank you for that.
Hey, Phil, thank you. Really great to have you here for this session, and glad that you were involved in this report. And really, your military expertise is really critical here in this sort of analysis. So thanks very much, Phil. So now let's go to Joe. And Joe, I have to tell you, out of all of the elements of Taiwan's resilience that has grabbed my attention, the attention of others, it seems that energy is the one that is in many ways is sort of the most striking from the statistics, and sort of the most, obvious, right? In a way, in part because of the work that you've done to bring focus to this question. And so I think you and many others listening here read my piece on deterrence through resilience that I wrote on, started writing actually while I was flying back from this trip to Taiwan a few weeks ago, and looking just out there at how vibrant Taiwan is, looking out the window at night, seeing all those lights, and then thinking about how if this dire situation comes into play and the PRC were to blockade the island, you could really see it go from this vibrant energetic island with a thriving economy to essentially looking almost pitch black like those satellite photos that you see of North Korea, and this is really worrisome to me and many others, and so the question is, how can we most quickly mitigate this risk? And when I say we, maybe what Taiwan could itself do, how could the United States and other interested allies and partners help to make some urgent progress here? Because I wonder if these things about like pricing strategies and these sorts of things, they seem to have a long-term strategic effect. But are there things that we can do really in the near term urgently to really move the needle on this question? So Joel, I've gone on quite a bit. Very interested to hear your thoughts on this issue.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for that. And thank you also to my co-authors. Really enjoyed working with you on this project. And finally, Dr. Su, I really appreciate your thoughtful comments, which were very helpful. So in terms of energy security for Taiwan, it's a huge problem. As Frank mentioned, Taiwan relies on seaborne imports for more than 95% of its energy needs. It's a very striking statistic, but it really shows the depth and the gravity and the immediacy of the problem, especially in the face of a PRC quarantine, blockade, siege, or invasion. And so, in regards to how do we move the ball forward very quickly in Taiwan, so Marcus, as you mentioned, some of these policies we recommend will take several months, several years, more likely, to really show significant effects. And so, one immediate policy is to not turn off Taiwan's access to nuclear energy for electricity. That's a very important step for Taiwan to take. There's been some encouraging progress that Taiwan is reevaluating its skepticism of nuclear energy, because as we mentioned, when it comes to Taiwan's energy needs, they're importing a very significant amount of energy resources, of commodities to satisfy these needs. And so one step to take is to just not shut down nuclear electricity in Taiwan. That would be certainly helpful in the short term. There's some other steps that Taiwan can take, and as you mentioned, these are not things that they can flip a switch on, literally or figuratively. These will take several months and frankly several years to really bear some fruit. But one is raising electricity prices, and so Taiwan is there's several different aspects of energy. Energy is composed of three sectors: electricity, transportation, and heating. We mostly concentrate on the electricity sector in our recommendations because we believe that is the area which is most ripe for reform. And so, as we talked about in the research project, Taiwan can ameliorate some of these problems by rationalizing prices. And by rationalizing prices, we mean, less politely, raising prices. So that would have two effects. The first is on the demand side. So Taiwan is relatively low electricity prices. It also consumes more coal per capita for the electricity sector than any other economy in the world, and that includes Australia, which is one of the world's most prolific exporters of coal. And so it doesn't really make a lot of sense for Taiwan to be using more coal for the electricity sector than any other country or than any other economy, given that Taiwan's importing all these resources. And so, raising prices would reduce electricity demand, but raising electricity prices would also have an impact on the supply side. By raising electricity prices, it would incentivize new forms of generation to hit the market. As has been mentioned already, there's potentially others, but really four main electricity supply sources for Taiwan. One is nuclear energy. The second is onshore wind. Offshore wind is also very important, frankly, probably more important than onshore wind. And finally, solar. And there are limitations to all segments of those generation methods, but if Taiwan incentivizes more production, you will see economic actors in Taiwan start to produce more electricity for their own reason. And as Marcus mentioned, this is not going to happen immediately. Nuclear power plants can take years, frankly, often decades, to be produced, and so it's a process that needs to be begun relatively quickly. With other projects like solar, those can be turned on relatively quickly. Those can be, potentially within just in some cases under a year. Onshore wind and offshore wind are have a little bit longer timelines. Typically in the case of somewhere between 2 to 6 years, depending on the project. But these are all measures that Taiwan should be considering immediately and as soon as possible. And we also recognize Dr. Su's comments, which I appreciate the feedback. We do recognize, and we talk about this in the report, that raising electricity prices, raising energy prices more broadly is going to face political challenges. And frankly, just as we see in other democracies, there's the potential for partisan actors to exploit rising prices. That we do recognize that that's a potential concern. And so one way to address that is to raise electricity prices and energy prices more broadly, to raise those prices gradually but continuously. So Taiwan currently has electricity review prices. They review electricity prices twice a year. We encourage them to increase the frequency of that to 4 times per year for a couple of reasons. One is they can have smaller increments for price increases, but secondly, Taiwan can be more responsive to potential crises in relations with mainland China. And so those are just some initial thoughts on how Taiwan can quickly take steps to mitigate some of these very serious energy security challenges it faces. Thank you.
Hey, Joe, thanks for that very thorough explanation. And it strikes me, to be honest, you could probably write an entire report just on energy resilience issues here. So this is such an important component of the conversation, and glad you could join us with your expertise. So now I'd like to turn, back to Frank to lead off on answering this next question. And I will say some really tremendously sophisticated questions coming in from the audience, and so I'm really impressed here. That's not to say if you're interested in asking a question, you shouldn't put one in, but we definitely have a lot here to work with in our discussion. So to go to Frank, though, Frank, you wrote this excellent report led this report on the 6th domain of warfare, the private sector, and several of the questions here are about the role of the private sector in strengthening Taiwan's resilience. And so I'll consolidate them a bit, but I think one of the leading ones here was from Dan Silver, who is the chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan, who we met with just a few weeks ago during our visit. And he asks, aside from cybersecurity, what role do you see for the U.S. business community in Taiwan in boosting Taiwan's resilience, both for their own company operations and for Taiwan overall, based on the risks and needs identified in your report? And so that's Dan's question. And if you want to address it a little bit more broadly, there were some others that asked about the challenges and opportunities between the public and private sectors in the U.S. and Taiwan to enhance resilience. So Frank, over to you, and then we can go to any other members of the group that would like to address this issue. So Frank, to you.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to underscore, I know the question said other than cyber, but I want to point out that in an information world, cyber is fundamental to basically every single industry that we're talking about, as well as the government actions. So glad to talk about the other things, but simply should not be forgotten. And the U.S. has some really fantastically good cyber companies, some of which are already working in the context of working with Taiwan and more broadly doing lots of things, for example, in Ukraine. A second obvious area to me is communications, and I mentioned it. We have just an expansion over the last 4 or 5 years of the ability to generate communications from space. So the civil capabilities in space are now remarkable. Everyone, I think, is reasonably aware of I shouldn't say that. What the Starlink company has done in Ukraine, for example, in helping Ukraine maintain its communications capabilities in the face of Russian attacks is both admirable and remarkable. And there are other companies who likewise have provided a great deal of capability in space. So maintaining communications, I mentioned low Earth orbit satellites, I think, would be one of the key arenas that needs to be worked on. Secondly, undersea cables is another important area. There are only, other than Chinese, there are only about 27 repair ships for undersea cables in the entire world. Building up that industry, and that would have to be done with the government or with multiple governments, I should say, because in the context of potential issues relating to both Russia and China, undersea cables would certainly come at risk. So we need to have a much more integrated approach by the cable owners, by the pipeline owners, and by the construction and repair companies. Starting in Taiwan is a good place. It goes much more broadly. So it's an industry-wide approach and actually a worldwide approach. And in the report that you mentioned, I did talk about creating essentially a U.S.-led, but nonetheless multi-country, multi-industry capability, which would cover Taiwan, but not only. So those are two immediate areas, I think, that need consideration. Then in Joe's area, he's already talked about offshore wind and onshore wind. Those are obvious areas for the private sector, and basically cannot be done without the private sector, and that's the same, of course, with respect to solar. So we have some really excellent companies, both American and others in the so-called G7 countries, the advanced economies, but also some of the others, very capable countries in the global South. So building up those three areas, onshore wind, offshore wind, and the like, would be important. And then Phil had pointed out the importance of enhancing infrastructure in the context of East Coast ports. So there's some really significant construction opportunities, I think, in Taiwan. Obviously, Taiwan has its own industries, but again, I think American industries play closely. So I suspect that there are other areas, maybe my colleagues should pick up on them, but those are at least 5 or 6 that come to mind off the top of my head. Thank you.
Hey, Frank, thanks so much. Very, very thorough explanation. Appreciate it. And would anyone else from the panel, you could raise your hand if you'd like to weigh in. So let's go to Beth next.
Hi, thanks, Marcus. And I completely agree with Frank on the private sector areas that he's landed on. I guess the other thing that comes to my mind is how crises play out in civil society, and just trying to get ahead of some of those partnerships with the private sector now. So things like, we touched on this in the report, food distribution and downstream fuel as well. So when you start to talk about rationing or planning for a paucity of food or fuel, then actually working with those private sector partners now to establish those plans and work together on resilience. I think that's another couple of sectors that struck me.
Thanks so much, Beth. And let's go to Joe.
Yeah, thank you. So just to echo what Frank and Beth said, there's certainly a lot of places where private actors can bolster resiliency. I would suggest that 2 of those areas are in electricity as well as water consumption. So there's different ways for different companies to look at. Are there ways to reduce electricity consumption? Are there efficiencies to garner? In the water, and for instance, in the water sector, most of the consumption comes from the agricultural sector. About 70% of Taiwan's water consumption is due to agriculture specifically, but industry is also very important as well. And so there might be cases where, especially semiconductor firms, chip manufacturers, may be able to reduce electricity and water consumption, and that's what I would encourage. That's a first step. In addition to ways that Frank and Beth mentioned.
Right, Joe, thanks. Yeah, no, yeah, the water element, as I've been thinking about, also strikes me as fairly critical, right? It's so vital for sustainment of the population of military operations. All right. Well, we have a whole series of other questions, and again, askac.org if you would like to add a question in. And so, as I'm sorting through here, I see several questions that are related to civil society or organizations, and we haven't heard from Dr. Su since his presentation in response to the report. And so, I'd like to go to Dr. Su next and ask him for his thoughts on the role of civil society organizations in Taiwan's resilience, his view there from on the ground. And so some of the sorts of questions we've been getting is the role of civil society organizations in collaboration between government and cybersecurity experts, how CSOs can incentivize the sacrifices essentially needed to enact some of these measures, like raising energy prices, and how can they support the training for civil defense and continued resistance in the event of a PRC attack? So, Dr. Su, any thoughts on those questions, the role of the civil society organizations? Oh, you're muted, Dr. Su.
You hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, so according to my observation, to really strengthen and to make the partnership between the public sector government and private sector successful in cooperation for this comprehensive defense, we have two obstacles to overcome. The first one, remember that 4 decades ago, we were still in martial law. So at that moment, we did have very solid partnership between the private sector and public sector. And for the Cold War period, at that moment, I was very young, but I remember for all schools, we have the military training. We had military trainings at high school, at the university. And for our generation, we have 2-year or 3-year military service for all male. And all the companies must register in all the mobilization number, and all the vans, buses must be enlisted in the mobilization, etc. So we had well, either the experience or the memory of that partnership. So that means we can do it, but now the problem is in democracy now, when we look back to that period, and not always positively. So we suppose that could be a way of the government to control the private sector. So that is a memory, I suppose, for the majority of Taiwanese today. So when the government want to force the private sector to register for this and say, wow, you come back, the big brother, you come back to control us. So that is a psychological obstacle for Taiwanese people. And that is first. And second, the Taiwanese society, like all democracy, are divided. So always no ruling government or party can win the absolute majority. And particularly now, for example, the current government is double minority. It's a minority president with minority parliamentary party. So just give you a good example, just before the voting day, just in January, 2 days, I remember 2 days before the voting day, the government issued the national alert of the air raid of Chinese missiles. But in the end, it was a satellite in outer space. But in our mobile phone, all the mobile phone was alerted, and the text was air raid. But that is for me not serious, because it's not air raid. It's just a satellite passing the outer space above Taiwan. But that wasn't regarded as a manipulation for the election. So that reduced the people's trust in the government in establishing the real national defense system in cooperation with the private sector. So I suppose that two obstacles to overcome. So for me, the key element for all the strategies and action plans successful in the future, establishing the comprehensive defense is really the trust in the government. And the trust in the government is based upon the honesty of the government on the subject. That means you have to really try to build up national defense without political manipulation too much. We know always we have political thinkings behind the project, but it's not too much. If that's too much, that reduces the people's trust in the government, and that will reduce the weaken the support. I suppose no Taiwanese want to surrender to the dictatorship, and we all want to maintain the democracy, the sovereignty, and prosperity, free market. I suppose we are one of the freest societies in Asia, and we are proud of it. And we want to maintain it. We want to maintain our connection with the world. And we want to establish the comprehensive, even you know that at a university, when I ask the girls in class, do you want to have 1 year conscription too? And some ladies, yes, we want, because it's a discrimination against the girls. We are not required to have the 1 year military service. That's a discrimination against the female. Not all girls, but some girls just raised hand and told us in class. So that means, I suppose, democracy is really, because we are young democracy, it's really the value that we want to defend. So I suppose the people have this determination and willingness to cooperate with government. But I suppose we need to build up the mutual trust between the government and private sectors. And that is very important for all the successful resilience and comprehensive defense plan in Taiwan or any democracy.
Dr. Su, thank you so much for that. And I think it's been really great to have your comments here to be able to explain some of the political and social realities in Taiwan, your view from on the ground, tremendously valuable. And this whole question of trust, is really key. And I think even trust, not just within Taiwan, but trust between, Taiwan, and its supporters and friends, in the world, and trust between Taiwan and the United States is so critical to this issue as well. So again, thank you very much. So again, we've got a whole series of very interesting questions, but I'd like to shift a little bit to the focus to the war in Ukraine and lessons learned, because we haven't heard from Phil. So there's several questions here that have come about lessons learned from the Ukraine war. And Phil, I know you were in Moscow, when the war really started, and have studied this question. And you're an expert in Taiwan, and you have this on the ground expertise of seeing the Russian war effort against Ukraine. So any thoughts on lessons learned, and particularly some of the questions came up in the context of the cyber aspect, and also there's a question about the threats to the nuclear implants in Ukraine, and many other questions. But really curious if you could share your thoughts, your assessments on what Taiwan can learn about resiliency, what we all could learn from the war in Ukraine as it's relevant to this discussion. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Obviously, a lot of important lessons that we can draw out. There are certainly clear differences between Ukraine's situation and Taiwan's situation. The geography is vastly different. The size and scope of the aggressor and the geography around Taiwan is vastly different. But we would be remiss not to attempt to look at some of the trends, some of the things that we can draw out, and there are many. One of the things I, as a naval officer, I look at is there is a direct lesson, and I know Taiwan is looking at this, on how Ukraine successfully broke a blockade in the Black Sea without a traditional navy, with a very incredible cooperation between private sector, technology brought in from outside, foreign assistance, intelligence sharing, and just plain innovation under a crisis. to break a blockade from a much larger, much outgunned, outmissiled situation. And so, this is why we took a look at, as Taiwan is, under a very similar threat, being, these exercise areas surrounding Taiwan from the PLA, these PLA Navy ships. There are some parallels to be drawn, which is why we look at the kinds of things that Ukraine has brought to bear, whether it's unmanned surface vehicles, wide area surveillance, using the right payloads on drones and manned aircraft. Many of these lessons, investments that Taiwan would want to take a look at today. The great question we had about what can U.S. industry contribute, and Frank's mention of East Coast Taiwan port infrastructure. By definition, any blockade and the current effort to surround the island, the weakest point of any blockade by the PLA would be those ships on the east coast of Taiwan. And so how do you make those ships and aircraft on the east coast of Taiwan, who are farthest away from their logistics chain, feel vulnerable today rather than until the crisis happens? Well, you complicate their planning efforts by investing in places that they didn't expect. You open up port infrastructure to private industry, which has the technology and the innovation that can be brought to bear. Make it an experimentation zone. Show up at unpredicted places. Don't be predictable to the PLA. That only gives them comfort that their actions are working, and take the lessons of being all weather and all daylight conditions to make them feel vulnerable, as Ukraine has successfully done and restored a good portion of its GDP by restoring the grain shipments on the west side of the Black Sea. So that's just one example there. As I look back on my experience in Moscow, witnessing the trends that predated and led up to the decision to invade Ukraine, whether it's the rhetoric, whether it's the cost imposition campaign before, and certainly the cost imposition strategy that is being executed against Ukraine, against civilian targets in infrastructure, we can say that many of these trends are very similar. The world is very aware of the close relationship between the leaders and the Kremlin leader and Beijing leader, and many of the rhetorical devices, cyber devices, and certainly the military cost imposition campaign follow a very worrisome and similar trend. And so things like decisions made today, can complicate the planning efforts to make sure that the lessons being learned from Beijing are complicated, and that it will not play out the same way around the Taiwan Straits as it has played out against Ukraine. So those are some of my thoughts.
Phil, thanks so much. And just as I said with Joe, it strikes me that one could write an entire report just on the military and defense aspects of deterrence. And so it's great to have you here for this discussion. And this whole idea of operational, essentially unpredictability as a key element of resilience, I found that to be an interesting aspect of this discussion. So we are, though, running low on times, and I do want to get to a few more questions here because we do have so many really excellent ones in here. And I'll go to the next one here. So I wanted to provide a little context real quick. Part of the logic here of how we construct the cross-strait and beyond seminar series is to bring in perspectives from the United States, of course, being a U.S.-based think tank, from Europe. And it's great that we had Beth here joining us, who brings a perspective from the UK and her experience. And then, of course, to have the on-the-ground perspective from experts in Taiwan, like with Dr. Su. And so this question pivots us back a little bit to looking at the European aspect of this. And so we have a question here. Let me pull it up that speaks to the potential for Europe to play a role in enhancing Taiwan's resilience, particularly Eastern Europe, because we do know, and from previous cross-strait seminars, that some Eastern European countries have really increased their relations with Taiwan. So this question comes from Lucas Soltes, and really appreciate the question. Interested if anyone in the group would volunteer to share their thoughts about how Europe could help enhance Taiwan's resilience. Anyone want to volunteer, or shall I turn to you first, Beth, if you're willing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are all sorts of points of collaboration here. I mean, I think back to that comprehensive security approach that has. Sorry, I thought I could hear another voice there. That comprehensive security approach that's worked so well in Nordic countries, actually sort of establishing peer relationships. And, as Dr. Su said, there are very particular circumstances in Taiwan that make this, it's not a sort of lift and drop these plans onto Taiwan, but certainly a lot of the kind of initiatives that Sweden, Finland, Estonia, for example, on misinformation, disinformation, I think there's a kind of creativity there that you could establish through those partnerships. That sort of sense of being on the front line of risk as well. I think there is a particular mutual support there that, and maybe not so much from a kind of UK perspective, but certainly from Eastern Europe and Nordic countries. I think there are real points of collaboration there. Dr. Su also talked about trust, and that is certainly a thing that we have worked on in many countries in Europe, and there are potentially quite a lot of ideas that have been developed to quite a sophisticated point on developing trust in relation to working with the public and private sector on risk. Really sophisticated communications campaigns, particularly in Sweden, where the conversation is at a really mature level with the population about the types of risks they're facing and what the public and what the private sector can and should do to try and manage risk or to respond in a crisis. So I think there are kind of lots of areas of kind of direct collaboration. There are then questions, aren't there, about the kind of geopolitical aspects of this and how Europe can lean in with its leverage at key points. I think that's also worth exploring. I guess the other thing is the work on critical national infrastructure and cyber resilience from a UK perspective, and we've been working very closely with the US on how to combat some of the incursions that we've seen, particularly over the last couple of years. And that work is at a really high level as well. So I think probably on cyber too, that's another area of collaboration.
Beth, thanks so much for that. Very, very helpful. Any other thoughts from the group? Dr. Su, over to you.
Yes, concerning the role of Europe or European Union or bigger Europe in the Strait in Asia, from a Taiwanese perspective, the ideal scenario will be a solid transatlantic solidarity for the peace and democracy in Asia. And that is really the expectation or really the imagined scenario for Taiwanese. And because we know that the hard security in Asia is really dependent upon the Americans' defense and the military power. And Europe could be a partner, a privileged partner in the U.S. security design in Asia. So for us, and perhaps the nightmare for Asian or including Taiwan allies of the U.S. is to see the disagreement between Washington and European capitals concerning Asia, and that would be really something worrying for Asia. And the best is the solidarity. And over the past decades, we see the closer relationship between Taiwan and particularly Central and Eastern and Baltic countries. And according to my understanding, is the fact that two reasons. One, these countries are more motivated to deepen their relationship with Taiwan compared to the leading European countries like France or Germany. So that is because they are more motivated to get even the partnership or exchange with Taiwanese. On the other hand, it's really, as Elizabeth said, that is really their past experience. They were once governed by communists and the Red Army. So in their domestic politics, to be challenging to the communists or to say no to Beijing and Moscow could be positive in their domestic campaign. So they like to use their visit to Taipei, a closer relationship with Taipei, to strengthen this image in their domestic politics. And for us, we know that, and it's good. But I suppose the uncertainty is the fact that quite often, according to our experience, is when their leaders, for example, the leaders change, their parties or their positions could change immediately. So that means it's not so sustainable. We are still looking at it. So that is what we see in Europe now. Yes.
Dr. Su, thank you very much. Would anyone else like to weigh in on this question before we move to what will be our final question? All right, I don't see any hands going up. So there certainly was, I think, an impression made here by Dr. Su's comment on the fact that the resilience of Taiwan is not just confined to the main island, and that it applies, also to those islands that are closer to the PRC in particular, and so this resonated with one of our audience asking a question here about the vulnerability of Kinmen and Matsu. The question here also asks, is building off of Phil's commentary, does Ukraine's experience in Crimea offer any lessons in this regard as well, in terms of bolstering resilience or preparedness there, given particularly the military activities that have been surrounding those islands in recent months. So I'd like to broaden the question, basically ask if anyone on the group would like to speak, whether specifically to the Ukraine-Crimea example, or more broadly to what can be done, or how we should be concerned about the resilience of Kinmen and Matsu as China steps up its campaign of what our President Fred Kemp likes to call strangulation of Taiwan. Anyone like to go first on this one? I see Phil's hand.
I'd be happy to kick off. Yeah. So I think it's a great point to add to the discussion. And a really important one is Taiwan's outer islands and the vulnerabilities there. Some are not defended militarily. Some are inside the territorial waters of mainland China. We see this game play out day in and day out with Coast Guard actions, what some call lawfare actions, and overreach. Most recently we've had seizure of Taiwan fishing vessels. We've had a regular series of mini crises in and around that space. We're in a situation today in which there are PLA Navy ships closer to the main island of Taiwan than the outer islands are distance-wise to Taiwan itself. And so if I could take a naval view of this, among the things Taiwan can do right now is not fall into the trap of the PLA's designs. And among the things that if we take the lessons of Ukraine, there's long before the events of February 24th, 2022, and the large-scale further invasion, there was a long-term cost imposition and shaping campaign meant to shape Ukraine, weaken their resolve, as well as to divide the international community, which really gets to many of the recommendations that we make in our report on the things that you can do to draw in, attention, as well as awareness, education, and commitment from the international community. Among those things, as difficult as it is for any government to raise its defense budget in a politically divisive environment, as well as a zero-sum budget situation, as Dr. Su has rightly pointed out, these are real concerns. One of the benefits of investing there is it does draw in attention from the international community that Taiwan is increasingly serious about its own defense, and this will draw in further commitment from the international community. And so that's one of the things we have learned from Ukraine. As they've inspired the world by fighting for themselves, it has brought in commitment from the outside as well. And that's a force multiplier that a little bit of the defense budget goes a long way. But on a more practical operational level, in terms of the things that Taiwan can do with respect to this outer island situation, which really comes down to a lawfare campaign, a shaping campaign, a cost imposition campaign, is to think about doing things differently rather than being predictable. For example, those ships that are surrounding Taiwan on a daily basis, on any given day, 3, 5, 8, or 9 ships that the Taiwan Ministry of Defense dutifully reports to the public in daily dispatches. The current approach is to shadow them one for one. This comes at a tremendous cost to the maintenance, morale, op tempo, as well as ability to train for warfighting by the Taiwan Armed Forces. And so this is where private sector comes in, utilizing the lessons of Ukraine, bringing in technology from outside. This is where the business community and the private sector come in, whether it's drone warfare, whether it's payloads on those drones or manned aircraft to increase one of the biggest gaps Taiwan has, is frankly the region has, which is maritime domain awareness, wide area surveillance capability, to maintain and have that wide area surveillance capability of those ships and aircraft coming in from the mainland without having to sacrifice the readiness of the military forces. And there are ways to do that by privatizing it, ways to do that using technology, and Taiwan has the workforce to do that. So those are among some of the things that we've seen from Ukraine, that Taiwan has the supply chain, the workforce, and the connectivity to the global private sector today, and could make some tweaks ultimately to make those PLA Navy ships not feel comfortable while they're being shadowed closely, but to feel uncomfortable and vulnerable because unpredictable means of tracking their movements and new means, innovative means of tracking their movements are being introduced at a speed of relevance.
Hey, Phil, thanks very much. So we're about at the end of our allotted time here. So I'd like to thank our excellent panel of expert speakers for their time and their insights. This rich discussion to me really underscored the many measures that could be taken to strengthen resilience, and also that there's a great deal of work to be done here. We heard today about some obstacles and some of the clear challenges as well as the opportunities, and taking advantage of these opportunities, overcoming these challenges is going to require, as we heard from Dr. Su, not only expending money, but of course deploying political capital to move forward. Now, the United States and its friends and allies, particularly as we heard in Europe, can help Taiwan, but ultimately Taipei has to take the lead and devote its own resources and have political leadership that's willing and able to convince the population to make these sacrifices, to implement these measures, and that these measures are both appropriate and necessary to increase resilience. And so really excited to see the additional insights that came out of this discussion, and particularly these points about operational unpredictability being key for resilience. So this is where our event today comes to a close, but this is definitely only the end of today's discussion, not of the overall dialogue and analysis that we're going to have at the Atlantic Council on these issues. And it's really just another milestone in conversations on this topic at the Atlantic Council with the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. So be sure to check out the Atlantic Council's website at atlanticcouncil.org for looking at our previous cross-strait and beyond seminars, and look for forthcoming content and events on subjects like building Taiwan's resilience and others important for Indo-Pacific security. If you haven't already signed up for our mailing list for these invitations, you can find it at the bottom of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative webpage. So thanks again to all of you who joined online, for the team here at the Council, and for our sponsors and their support. And we hope to see you at future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I know.